In August of 2009, a technical diver named Owen Kessler dropped through the green upper layer of Lake Superior into the black cold beneath it, off the northern edge of the Keweenaw Peninsula, on a dive he expected to be routine. He had logged more than 200 descents along that stretch of coast, most of them wreck work, and this one was meant to be nothing more than a test of a new rebreather regulator before a deeper expedition planned for later that month. At 31 meters, his light caught an edge that did not belong to the rubble slope he was expecting to find. A flat course of stone, squared rather than fractured, ran in a straight line for close to 9 meters before it disappeared into silt. Kessler is not an archaeologist, and by every account given of him since, he is not a man given to wonder. In an interview he gave 11 months later to a regional diving publication, he said his first reaction was irritation, not discovery. Certain he had drifted off his marks and surfaced onto a breakwater left behind by a mining company that had worked that coast a century earlier. There is no breakwater on any chart for that stretch of shoreline. There never has been. He surfaced, checked his position twice against a handheld unit, and went back down with a second light. What he found on the return dive was not one course of stone but two, meeting at a corner close enough to a right angle that his dive partner, an engineer named Paul Renner, measured it later with a protractor brought from his own toolbox and recorded 89.4 degrees. Neither man touched the stone that day. Both agreed afterward, without discussing it beforehand, that whatever this was, deserved a camera before it deserved a hand. A third diver, Mara Voss, joined them for the following weekend's return trip, and her own account, recorded separately from Kessler's and Renner's, matches theirs on every measurement that matters: the corner, the coursing, the silt line where the second wall disappears. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the footage from that second dive shows, and what 3 subsequent expeditions over the following 2 years would confirm in greater detail, is not a single wall, but a coursed structure. 2 runs of squared stone meeting at a corner, a scatter of displaced blocks nearby consistent with a third wall that had collapsed rather than eroded, and a shallow depression behind the corner that a hydrologist who later reviewed the footage described, cautiously, as consistent with a floor rather than a natural basin. The blocks themselves average 40 centimeters on their long edge, quarried rather than glacially deposited, their faces showing the kind of flat, deliberate fracture that comes from repeated percussion at a chosen angle, rather than the random shatter of frost or ice movement. No mortar binds them. None was needed. The coursing alone, block resting on block with barely a finger's width of give between them, is doing the work that mortar does everywhere else in the archaeological record of the region, and doing it without a single joint wider than what a modern mason would consider acceptable tolerance. Renner, whose profession gave his measurements more weight than a casual observer's would have carried, returned twice more over the following year, with survey equipment borrowed from his firm, and his final report, circulated privately rather than published, records 26 individual blocks in place along the 2 standing walls, with a further 19 identified in the collapse scatter. Not one showed the rounded, water-tumbled edges typical of glacial erratics found elsewhere on that same lakebed, stones Renner photographed for comparison not 50 meters from the structure itself. The difference, he wrote, was not subtle. It was the difference between a rock that has been rolled and a rock that has been placed. What none of the 3 divers found across 5 combined expeditions to the site was anything else. No tools, no hearth residue, no scatter of the broken pottery or worked flint that turns up, almost without exception, at every other confirmed pre-contact site in the region once excavation begins. A structure this deliberate, built by hands skilled enough to hold a right angle without instruments, ordinarily leaves behind the debris of the people who used it. This one did not. Whoever built it did not leave in a hurry, and did not leave the way a site is left when it is simply abandoned. It was cleared. Lake Superior's shoreline was not always where it is now. After the retreat of the last glacial ice sheet, the lake passed through a series of lower stages as the land beneath it, freed from the enormous weight of ice, slowly rose back into shape, a process geologists call isostatic rebound. One of those stages, known to the field as the Houghton low stand, held the lake's surface as much as 100 meters below its current level for a stretch of roughly 2,000 years, somewhere between 9,500 and 7,500 years ago, before the rebounding land at the lake's outlet raised the water back up and drowned whatever had been built on what was, for those 2,000 years, dry and habitable ground. 31 meters of depth places the Keweenaw structure comfortably within that window. No organic material was recovered from the joints between the blocks, which ruled out a direct radiocarbon date on the structure itself, a gap the site's few examiners have been candid about, rather than papering over. What the depth argument offers instead is not a date on the stone, but a date on the water, and the water's own history is documented well enough, through core samples taken elsewhere on the lake bed over the past 4 decades, that the absence of a direct date does not leave the timeline open-ended so much as it leaves one particular kind of proof unavailable. If the stone was set by hand, rather than shaped by chance, it was set on land that would not see water again for millennia, and it has not been touched by human hands since the water closed back over it. Kessler reported the find to his state's Historic Preservation Office in the spring following the initial dive, as regulation required once he understood what he might be sitting on. A survey team was dispatched that June, and the office's own dive log records their arrival, their equipment manifest, and a preliminary sketch made on the first day on site, initialed by a field coordinator whose name appears nowhere else in the office's public records before or after that season. The log then goes silent. 3 consecutive days are missing from a record that had, up to that point, been maintained without a single gap for the preceding 4 years of the office's underwater survey work. The entry that resumes, 4 days after the team's documented arrival, opens mid-sentence, referencing a decision already made about site access without ever recording what that decision was or who made it. No storm is noted in the regional weather record for those 3 days. No equipment failure is logged. A public records request filed years later for the coordinator's field notes from that week returned a response stating the relevant file could not be located. The blank is the record. A geologist named Elena Radcliffe, then on faculty at a university in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, was brought in independently that same summer, having worked previously on submerged shoreline dating elsewhere in the Great Lakes Basin. Radcliffe's preliminary paper, circulated to a handful of colleagues but never formally submitted for publication, argued that the depth, the coursing, and the absence of any natural process that produces squared blocks at a consistent right angle together suggested a human-built structure, predating, by a wide margin, every confirmed occupation site currently dated for the western Lake Superior Basin. It was a careful paper hedged in the places where the evidence did not yet support a firmer claim, and it ended by requesting funding for a full excavation survey the following season. That funding was never formally denied. It simply never appeared on the department's approved list, a decision the meeting minutes attribute to budget constraints affecting the whole division that year, without singling out Radcliffe's request or the site itself. The following term, Radcliffe's research shifted to peat bog stratigraphy in a different part of the state, a subject with no connection to the Keweenaw find. Her later correspondence, portions of which were shared by a former colleague, describes the change only as following where the funding actually was. She has not published on the submerged structure since, and colleagues who worked alongside her in those years say she does not raise it in conversation unless someone else does first. A regional weekly newspaper ran a short item on the find that same August, 4 paragraphs buried on an inside page, sourced to a divers forum post rather than to the state office directly. It is the only press coverage the site has ever received, and it ran before the Preservation Office's own log went quiet, which means the public record of this discovery is, in its entirety, older than the silence that followed it. The field coordinator whose initials appear on that first day's sketch has never been identified by name in any document Kessler, Renner, or Radcliffe has been able to obtain. A separate public records request for the office's staffing roster from that season lists the survey team by title rather than by name, a formatting choice the office's records officer described, when asked, as standard practice for that particular filing year and no other. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Keweenaw find is not the only submerged structure the Great Lakes Basin has produced, and the comparison is instructive precisely because the two best-known cases did not meet the same fate. In Rock Lake, Wisconsin, local residents have described stone mounds resting on the lake bed since at least the opening years of the 20th century, formations some early accounts likened to pyramids, though no formal excavation has ever been mounted to confirm what lies beneath the silt that has since settled over them. Sport divers have photographed the mounds intermittently since the 1930s, and each round of photographs prompts the same brief flurry of local interest. A newspaper item, a university professor quoted declining to comment without a formal survey, and then silence again for another decade, until the next set of photographs surfaces. What you are looking at in every one of those photographs is the same low, silt-covered rise, never excavated, never dated, never explained, and never quite forgotten either. More than a century on, the site remains a matter of local tradition passed between divers and residents, rather than a documented survey. In Lake Huron, along a submerged ridge, known to geologists as the Alpena Amberley Ridge, a University of Michigan archaeologist named John O'Shea led a fully published, peer-reviewed survey beginning in 2009 that identified stone drive lanes built to funnel caribou toward waiting hunters, structures dated through the same post-glacial low-stand logic to roughly 9,000 years before the present. O'Shea's find reached a major scientific journal within 2 years of its discovery, complete with sonar maps, dive logs, and a public university press release. The Huron drive lanes were built to a functional logic that made sense the moment archaeologists saw them. Low stone walls angled to narrow a caribou herd's path toward a kill site, a purpose that fit neatly into an existing model of how post-glacial hunters worked this landscape. The Keweenaw corner fits no existing model at all. It is not a drive lane, not a fish weir, not any of the low, functional stone arrangements the region's confirmed pre-contact sites have already trained researchers to expect. A right angle, held to 1/10 of a degree, serves no hunting purpose anyone has proposed. What is consistent across all three sites is the depth, the post-glacial dating logic, and the presence of deliberate stone arrangement below water that has not been navigable on foot for thousands of years. What is not consistent is the outcome. One site fit the expected pattern and was surveyed, published, and folded into the accepted timeline of the region within a matter of months. Two others, older by tradition or stranger by design, have sat for decades or, in the Keweenaw case, for years now, without a single formal excavation permit issued. The difference was never the evidence. It was what the evidence was allowed to mean. Not everything from the Keweenaw dives passed through the state's hands. Renner retrieved a single fist-sized fragment from the scatter of displaced blocks during the second expedition, before the Preservation Office's team had established any protocol for site access, and before anyone present understood that a protocol would later be required. That fragment has never been surrendered to any institution. It remains, by every account given since, in a drawer in a house in Wisconsin, available to be tested by anyone with the equipment and the standing to ask for it. Renner has said, in one of the few interviews he has agreed to, that he keeps it less as evidence than as a reminder that the file on this site is not actually closed, just because no one is currently opening it. In 2015, a graduate student researching post-glacial shorelines contacted Renner after finding a passing mention of the fragment in an old diving forum thread, and asked to arrange an independent mineral analysis at her own department's expense. Renner agreed. The sample was mailed, logged as received by the department's front office, and then, according to the student's own later account, could not be located when she went to retrieve it for testing 8 weeks later. No results were ever produced. No further request for a replacement sample was made, by the student or by anyone else. No one currently affiliated with either university that has touched this case has asked Renner to see what remains of it. What the Keweenaw structure requires, if the depth is right and the coursing is what the footage shows it to be, is not a correction to a footnote. It is a builder working in stone, with tools and techniques sufficient to quarry, shape, and set blocks to a tolerance a modern mason would recognize, on ground that has been under 100 meters of the coldest fresh water in North America for longer than any other confirmed structure in the region has stood above it. It requires people organized enough to hold that tolerance across 2 full walls rather than one lucky corner, and it requires enough time on dry, forested ground that would not see water again for 2,000 years, to finish what they started before something, whether flood, retreat, or choice, moved them off it entirely. No hearth, no tool cache, no burial. A site built with that much care does not usually leave this little behind unless the leaving itself was deliberate. Who that builder was is not settled by the stone itself, and the record, where it survives at all, does not settle it either. The existing chronology for the western Lake Superior Basin, built from confirmed sites on land, does not currently reach back far enough to name them, and nothing in the Keweenaw evidence requires overturning what is known about the people who are already documented in that chronology. It requires only room being made for an earlier chapter nobody has yet been able to write, because the physical page for it is sitting underwater nobody has been funded to search since 2011. What you are looking at, if the camera could travel down through 31 meters of water the color of tarnished pewter, is not a ruin in the way a ruin is usually understood, broken and picked over by centuries of passing hands. It is closer to a room that was finished, used briefly or not at all, and then sealed by rising water before anyone thought to strip it bare, the way abandoned places usually are stripped. The silt that has covered it for millennia has also, in its own way, protected it, holding the corner at 89.4 degrees through 9,000 years of ice, current, and the slow, patient work of a lake that does not forget where it has been. What the record does show, consistently, across a state preservation log gone silent for 3 days, a field coordinator's notes that no longer exist, a geologist's funding that vanished without a formal no, and a fragment that has sat in a drawer for more than a decade without a single institution asking to see it, is a pattern of a find that was allowed to go quiet, rather than a find that was ever disproven. Nobody wrote a report concluding the corner was natural. Nobody wrote a report at all. Radcliffe's unpublished paper is still, as of this writing, the only formal scientific document ever produced on the Keweenaw structure, sitting in a personal file rather than a journal archive, cited by no one because it was never placed anywhere citation could find it. A find does not need to be disproven to disappear. It only needs to be left exactly where Radcliffe's paper was left, filed, hedged, and quietly set aside, for long enough that the people who might have followed up simply moved on to whatever their departments were still willing to fund. Owen Kessler still dives that same stretch of coast most summers. He has said, in the only interview he has given on the subject since Renner's, that he no longer expects anyone to come looking, and that he has stopped waiting for them to. He still checks the corner each season anyway, out of habit more than hope, clears the same patch of silt with the same slow sweep of his hand, and surfaces without calling anyone. The corner is still there, 31 meters down, 89.4 degrees, exactly where his light first found it. It has been waiting considerably longer than he has, and it shows no sign of being in any hurry to stop. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.